The sun was setting over the mesa when Dutch found her, and that old dog had never made a sound like that before in all his 12 years. Margaret Hayes heard it from the kitchen where she was washing dinner plates, and she knew right away something was different about this bark because Dutch was a quiet dog who only spoke when it mattered. She dried her hands on her apron and walked out to the porch where her husband Robert was already standing with his hand shading his eyes against the late afternoon light. The dog was out by the dry wash about 100 yards from the house, and he was circling something and barking in that urgent way that made Margaret's chest tighten. Robert was already moving down the steps, and Margaret followed him without bothering to take off her apron because something in Dutch's voice told her there wasn't time for that. When they reached the wash, they saw what Dutch had found, and Margaret put her hand to her mouth because there in the sandy soil was a woman, and she was halfway out of the ground. Her face was covered in dirt and her dress was torn and filthy, but her eyes were open and she was breathing in short gasping breaths like someone who had been underwater too long. Robert knelt down beside her and Margaret did too, and the woman looked at them with eyes that seemed to see everything and nothing at the same time. "They buried me wrong," she said, and her voice was rough like gravel, like she hadn't used it in a long time. Margaret took the woman's hand, and it was cold despite the warmth of the evening, and she said, "We've got you now and you're going to be all right." Robert ran back to the house to call for help, and Margaret stayed with the woman and Dutch lay down beside them like he was standing guard. The woman kept trying to talk and Margaret told her to save her strength, but she wouldn't stop. "I wasn't dead," she said, and her fingers gripped Margaret's hand with surprising strength, "and they put me in the ground anyway." Margaret felt tears on her cheeks because she couldn't imagine anything more terrifying than waking up in darkness underground, and somehow this woman had clawed her way to the surface. The ambulance came and the paramedics were gentle as they lifted her onto the stretcher, and one of them said it was a miracle she had survived, and Margaret looked at Dutch and thought, yes, but it was also a dog who cared enough to go looking. The hospital kept the woman for 3 weeks, and during that time the whole story came out piece by piece like a puzzle someone had scattered across a table. Her name was Helen Porter, and she was 61 years old, and she had lived alone in a small house on the other side of the county. She had collapsed one morning from what the doctors said was a condition that made her heart slow down so much it seemed to stop, and her breathing became so shallow you couldn't see it. The neighbor who found her had called the authorities, and the local doctor had pronounced her dead, and because Helen had no family nearby, the county had arranged for a quick burial. But Helen wasn't dead, and somewhere in that darkness she had woken up and realized where she was. The doctors said it was impossible that she could have dug herself out, but Helen said, "When you think you're going to die in the dark, you find strength you didn't know you had." Margaret visited her every day in the hospital and brought her homemade soup and fresh bread because Helen still couldn't eat much solid food. They talked about everything and nothing the way women do when they recognize something familiar in each other. Helen told Margaret about her life and about the husband she had lost 10 years ago to cancer, and about the son who had moved to Seattle and called once a month if she was lucky. She talked about feeling invisible in recent years. Like the world had stopped seeing her because she was getting older and lived alone and didn't make much noise in the world. Margaret understood because she was 57 herself, and she knew how it felt when store clerks looked past you and younger people spoke louder like you couldn't hear properly. When Helen was finally released from the hospital, she had nowhere to go because the county had already cleaned out her house and sold what little she had owned to cover the burial costs. Margaret didn't even have to ask Robert because she knew what he would say, and sure enough, when she mentioned that Helen needed a place to stay, he just nodded and said, "Of course she'll come here." So Helen moved into the spare bedroom that had once belonged to their daughter Sarah before she grew up and moved to Phoenix. Margaret made curtains for the windows and Robert built new shelves, and they set up the room like it had always been meant for Helen. Dutch appointed himself Helen's guardian and followed her everywhere and slept outside her bedroom door at night like he was making sure nobody could take her away again. The first few weeks were hard because Helen would wake up screaming in the night thinking she was back in the ground, and Margaret would come and sit with her until the fear passed. They would drink chamomile tea in the kitchen and watch the sun come up and talk about nothing important until Helen's hands stopped shaking. Slowly Helen began to heal in ways that went deeper than just her body. She started helping Margaret in the garden, and her hands remembered how to coax life from the soil, and she smiled when the first tomatoes came in red and perfect. She learned to bake bread the way Margaret's grandmother had taught her, and soon the house smelled like yeast and warmth every morning. Robert taught her to play chess in the evenings, and she turned out to have a mind for strategy that surprised him and made him concentrate harder. The three of them fell into rhythms that felt natural, like they had always been meant to live this way. Helen never talked about going back to living alone, and Margaret never suggested it because some things don't need to be said out loud. The county officials came around once asking questions about what had happened and how someone could have been buried alive, and Helen told them she didn't want to pursue any legal action. She said mistakes happen and people do their best, and she was alive now and that was all that mattered. Margaret admired that about her because not everyone could let go of anger that had such a good reason to exist. One evening about 6 months after Dutch had found her, Helen and Margaret were sitting on the porch watching the sunset paint the mesa in shades of orange and purple. Helen said, "You know, I used to think my life was over even before they put me in the ground." Margaret didn't say anything because she knew Helen needed to finish the thought. "I was just going through the motions," Helen continued, "and waiting to die for real, because what was the point of any of it? But now," Helen said, and her voice got softer, "and now I wake up every morning and I'm grateful for another day, and I notice things I never noticed before." "Like what?" Margaret asked. "Like the way the light comes through the kitchen window in the morning," Helen said, "and the sound of Dutch's feet on the floor, and the smell of coffee brewing, and the feeling of dirt under my fingernails when we work in the garden." She paused and looked at Margaret with eyes that had seen darkness most people couldn't imagine. "Like having friends who didn't even know me but took me in anyway," she said. Margaret reached over and took Helen's hand, and they sat like that until the stars came out. The next spring, Helen's son Michael finally came to visit after Margaret had called him and explained what had happened. He was a thin man in his late 30s who wore expensive clothes and looked uncomfortable in the country. He kept apologizing to Helen for not being there and for not calling more and for not knowing she had been buried alive. Helen hugged him and told him she understood that life gets busy and people have their own paths to walk. But Margaret could see the sadness in Helen's eyes when Michael left after only 2 days, saying he had to get back to work. After he drove away, Helen stood in the yard for a long time and Dutch came and pressed against her leg. Margaret came out and stood beside her and said, "Family isn't always about blood." Helen nodded and wiped her eyes and said, "I know that now." The seasons turned and life continued in the way it does when people find their place in the world. Helen started volunteering at the local library, reading to children on Saturday mornings, and she discovered she had a gift for doing different voices that made the kids laugh. She joined Margaret's quilting circle and learned to piece together scraps of fabric into beautiful patterns. She took long walks with Dutch across the mesa and came back with stories about the birds she had seen and the wildflowers that were blooming. On Helen's 63rd birthday, they had a party with neighbors and friends from church and the quilting circle. Someone asked Helen what it felt like to get a second chance at life, and she thought about it for a long time before answering. She said, "It feels like waking up," she said, "and like finally understanding that every single day is a gift, whether you almost lost it or not." She looked around at the faces of people who had become her family and said, "But the real gift isn't the breathing or the heartbeat. It's finding people who see you," she said, "and who make room for you in their lives and who love you not because they have to but because they choose to." Margaret felt tears on her face and Robert squeezed her hand and Dutch barked once like he agreed. That night, after everyone had gone home and the dishes were washed and put away, the three of them sat on the porch like they did most evenings. Helen said, "You know, when I was in that darkness underground, I made myself a promise." "What was that?" Robert asked. "I promised that if I ever got out I would never waste another day," she said, "and I would never take for granted the simple things like sunshine and fresh air and people who care." "And have you kept that promise?" Margaret asked. "Every single day," Helen said, "and every single day I'm grateful that Dutch found me and that you two didn't turn away." Robert cleared his throat the way he did when he was feeling emotional and said, "We're the lucky ones, Helen." The three of them sat in comfortable silence and watched the stars come out one by one. Dutch lay at Helen's feet with his head on her shoe and his tail thumped softly against the wooden boards of the porch. Margaret thought about how life has a way of bringing people together when they need each other most, and how sometimes the worst things that happen to us can lead to the best things if we let them. She thought about how Helen had been invisible before and how she had been buried alive both literally and figuratively. But now Helen was seen and known and loved, and she was more alive than she had been in years. And Margaret realized that she and Robert were more alive too, because Helen had brought something into their house that had been missing. She had brought purpose and laughter and the reminder that every day matters and that kindness is never wasted. Years passed and they grew older together the way families do. Helen's hair turned completely white and Margaret's arthritis made her hands stiff in the mornings and Robert moved a little slower than he used to. But they still had their routines and their evening conversations on the porch and their quiet contentment with the life they had built together. Dutch eventually passed away in his sleep at the age of 16 and they buried him on the mesa in a spot where he had loved to sit and watch the sunset. Helen planted wildflowers on his grave and said he saved my life and I'll never forget him. They got another dog eventually, a young mutt from the shelter who they named Scout and who had some of Dutch's gentle wisdom even though he was more energetic. Helen taught Scout to be calm around the library children and he became part of her Saturday morning routine. On quiet evenings when the wind blew across the mesa and the sky turned colors that had no names, Helen would sometimes tell visitors her story. She would talk about being buried alive and about Dutch finding her and about Margaret and Robert taking her in. But she always ended the story the same way. She would say, the worst thing that ever happened to me led me to the best life I could have imagined. And she would say, I learned that it's never too late to start over and that family is what you make it and that kindness is the most powerful force in the world. Margaret would listen to Helen tell her story and she would think about how true that was. Because kindness had made all the difference. It had made Margaret and Robert open their home to a stranger. It had made Helen forgive the people who had buried her alive. It had made a community embrace a woman who had been invisible before. And it had created a family out of 3 people and a dog who might never have met if the world had been less cruel or less kind. As the sun set on another day, Helen and Margaret sat on the porch with their tea and watched the colors spread across the sky. Helen said, "Thank you again." Margaret said, "You never have to thank us." But Helen said, "I know, but I'm going to anyway because gratitude is important." They sat in comfortable silence and somewhere in the distance Scout barked at something only he could see. And life continued in its gentle way, full of small moments that added up to everything that mattered.